The new model army of England was formed in 1645 by the Parliamentarians in the English Civil War, and was disbanded in 1660 after the Restoration. It differed from other armies in the series of civil wars referred to as the Wars of the Three Kingdoms in that it was intended as an army liable for service anywhere in the country, rather than being tied to a single area or garrison. Its soldiers became full-time professionals, rather than part-time militia. To establish a professional officer corps, the army's leaders were prohibited from having seats in either the House of Lords or House of Commons. This was to encourage the separation from the political or religious factions among the parliamentarians. The new model army was raised partly from among veteran soldiers who already had deeply held Puritan religious convictions, and partly from conscripts who brought with them many commonly held beliefs about religion of society. Many of its common soldiers therefore held dissenting or radical views unique among English armies. Although the army's senior officers did not share many of the soldiers' political opinions, their independence from Parliament led to the army's willingness to contribute to the overthrow of both the Crown and Parliament's authority, and to establish a Commonwealth of England from 1649 to 1660, which included a period of direct military rule. Ultimately, the army's generals could rely both on the army's internal discipline and its religious zeal and innate support for the good old cause to maintain an essentially dictatorial rule. Foundation. The new model army was formed as a result of dissatisfaction among parliamentarians with the conduct of the Civil War in 1644. Although the parliamentarians had a clear advantage in financial resources and manpower over the royalists, most of the forces were raised by local associations of counties and could rarely be used far from their homes. As early as the 2nd of July of that year, Sir William Waller discovered that his London-based units were refusing to campaign further afield, and wrote, "An army compounded of these men will never go through with your service until you have an army merely your own that you may command. It is in a manner impossible to do anything of importance." There was also increasing dissension among Parliament's generals in the field. Parliament suspected that many of its senior officers, who were mainly Presbyterians, were inclined to favour peace with King Charles, and were conducting operations half-heartedly as a result. The Earl of Manchester was one of the prominent members favouring peace, but his Lieutenant General, Oliver Cromwell, strongly advocated fighting the war to the finish. Manchester and Cromwell clashed publicly over this issue several times. Parliament's senior commander, the Earl of Essex, was also suspected of lack of determination and was on poor terms with his subordinates. The tensions among the parliamentarian generals became a bitter public argument after the Second Battle of Newbury. Some of them believed that King Charles's army had escaped encirclement after the battle through inaction on the part of some commanders. On the 19th of November 1644, the Parliamentarian Eastern Association of Counties announced that they could no longer meet the cost of maintaining the forces, which at the time provided about half the field force available to Parliament. In response, Parliament directed the Committee of Both Kingdoms, the cabinet-like body that oversaw the conduct of the war, to review the state of all Parliament's forces. On the 19th of December, the House of Commons passed the Self-Denying Ordinance, which prevented members of the Houses of Lords and Commons from holding any military office. Originally a separate matter from the establishment of the new model army, it soon became intimately linked with it. Once the Self-Denying Ordinance ordinance became a law, the Earls of Manchester and Essex, and other Presbyterian members of Parliament and peers, were removed from command in the field. On 6 January 1645, the Committee of both Kingdoms established the new model army, appointing Sir Thomas Fairfax as its Captain General and Sir Philip Skippon as Sergeant Major General of the foot. The self-denying ordinance took time to pass the House of Lords, but came into force on 3 April 1645, about the same time as the new model army first took the field. Although Oliver Cromwell handed over his command of the army's cavalry when the ordinance was enacted, Fairfax requested his services when another officer wished to emigrate. Cromwell was commissioned colonel of Vermuyden's former regiment of horse, and was appointed lieutenant general of the horse in June. Cromwell and his son-in-law Henry Ireton were two of the only 4 exceptions to the self-denying ordinance, the other 2 being local commanders in Cheshire and North Wales. They were allowed to serve under a series of 3-month temporary commissions that were continually extended. Parliament decreed the consolidation of most of the forces outside the new model army into 2 other locally recruited armies, those of the Northern Association under Sydenham Points and the Western Association under Edward Massey. They were intended to reduce the remaining Royalist garrisons in their areas and prevent Royalist incursions. Some of the regiments were reorganized and incorporated into the new model army during and after the Second English Civil War. Establishment and early character. The new model army consisted on paper of 22,000 soldiers, comprising 11 regiments of cavalry each of 600 men for a total of 6,600, 12 regiments of infantry each of 1,200 men for a total of 14,400, and 1 regiment of 1,000 dragoons, units from the existing Parliamentarian armies of the Earl of Essex, the Southern Association under Sir William Waller and the Eastern Association under the Earl of Manchester were reassigned to provide regiments for the new army. Although the cavalry regiments were already well up to strength and there was no shortage of volunteers, the regiments of foot soldiers needed 7,000 reinforcements to be brought up to full strength. Men were impressed from Parliamentarian-held areas in the south and east to provide the necessary drafts, but many of these soon deserted and the army was still 4,000 men short of its paper infantry establishment in May 1645. A Soldier's Catechism set out new regulations and drill procedures. The standard daily pay was 8 pence for infantry and 2 shillings for cavalry. The administration of the army was more centralized, with improved provision of adequate food, clothing and other supplies. Cavalrymen had to supply their own horses. The founders intended that proficiency rather than social standing or wealth should determine the army's leadership and promotions. Many officers of existing units merged into regiments of the new model army became surplus to the organization and were discharged. Such reformados demonstrated several times in London as they sought compensation or relief. Many corporals and sergeants, particularly in the Earl of Essex's army, were unable to find posts in the merged regiments, but they were persuaded to serve as ordinary soldiers. Contemporary accounts reported that this was due to the popular Sir Philip Skippon's success in exhorting them to stay on, but historians have suggested that the reasons were economic. The former non-commissioned officers did not think they could find work outside the army. An observer, Sir Samuel Luke, who was one of the officers discharged from the Earl of Essex's army, wrote on 9 June 1645 that the army was the bravest for bodies of men, horse and arms so far as the common soldiers as ever I saw in my life. However, he later complained that many soldiers were drunk, and that many officers were hard to tell from ordinary soldiers. Cromwell accepted only soldiers and especially officers who were dedicated to Protestant ideals, as he was. Earlier during the Civil War he had written to Sir William Spring saying that he would rather have a plain, russet-coated captain, that knows what he fights for, and loves what he knows, than what you call a gentleman and is nothing else. During the Army's formation, some Presbyterians considered it a hotbed of independence, a potentially dangerous situation given that Parliament's agreement with the Scottish Covenanters stipulated that Presbyterianism would be the established church in England. Several prominent Presbyterian officers, mainly expatriate Scottish professional soldiers, refused to serve in the new model army on religious grounds. Two of the first colonels appointed in the army were known extreme independents. Pickering even preached sermons to his troops, for which Fairfax reprimanded him. The Earl of Essex brought a motion in the House of Lords to prevent Montague and Pickering, and 40 captains who were reportedly of the same persuasion, from holding commissions, but after a tied vote, the motion was not passed to the House of Commons and they were allowed to serve. Prince Rupert of the Rhine, an archetypal cavalier and prominent general in the army of King Charles I, nicknamed the new model troops Ironsides. This referred to their ability to cut through opposing forces. Name. The Oxford English Dictionary dated the earliest use of the phrase New Model Army to the works of the Scottish historian Thomas Carlyle in 1845, and the exact term does not appear in 17th or 18th century documents. Records from February 1646 refer to the New Modelled Army, the idiom of the time being to refer to an army that was new modelled rather than appending the word army to new model. Original order of battle equals a significant effort by the House of Lords to block appointment. Equals a significant effort by the House of Commons to block appointment. Dress, equipment and tactics. Horse. The new model army's elite troops were its regiments of horse. They were armed and equipped in the style known at the time as harquebusiers rather than as heavily armored cuirassiers. They wore a back and front breastplate over a buff leather coat which itself gave some protection against sword cuts, and normally a lobster-tailed pot helmet with a movable 3-barred visor and a bridle gauntlet on the left hand. The sleeves of the buff coats were often decorated with strips of braid, which may have been arranged in a regimental pattern. Leather bucket-top riding boots gave some protection to the legs. Regiments were organized into 6 troops of 100 troopers plus officers, non-commissioned officers and specialists. Each troop had its own standard, 2 feet square. On the battlefield, a regiment was normally formed as 2 divisions of 3 troops, one commanded by the regiment's colonel, the other by the lieutenant colonel. Their discipline was markedly superior to that of the royalist counterparts. Cromwell specifically forbade his men to gallop after a fleeing enemy, but demanded they hold the battlefield. This meant that the new model cavalry could charge, break an enemy force, regroup and charge again at another objective. On the other hand, when required to pursue, they did so relentlessly, not breaking ranks to loot abandoned enemy baggage as royalist horse often did. Dragoons. The new model army contained 1 regiment of dragoons, of 12 companies each of 100 men, under Colonel John Oakey. Dragoons were mounted infantry, and wore much the same uniform as musketeers, although they probably wore sailcloth gaiters to protect their legs while riding. They were armed with flintlock snap-lances rather than the matchlock muskets carried by the infantry. On the battlefield, a major function was to clear enemy musketeers from in front of the main position. At the Battle of Naseby, they were used to outflank enemy cavalry. They were also useful in patrolling and scouting. In sieges, they were often used to assault breaches carrying flintlock carbines and grenades. The storming party were sometimes offered cash payments, as this was a very risky job. Once the forlorn hope established a foothold in the enemy position, the infantry followed them with the more cumbersome pikes and matchlock muskets. In 1650, Oki's Dragoons were converted into a regiment of horse. It appears that after that date, unregimented companies of dragoons raised from the militia and other sources were attached to the regiments of horse and foot as required. This was the case at the Battle of Dunbar on 3 September 1650. The regiments of foot consisted of 10 companies, in which musketeers and pikemen were mixed, at least on the march. 7 companies consisted of 100 soldiers, plus officers, specialists and so on, and were commanded by captains. The other 3 companies were nominally commanded by the regiment's colonel, lieutenant colonel and major, and were stronger. The regiments of foot were provided with red coats. Red was chosen because uniforms were purchased competitively from the lowest bidder, and Venetian red was the least expensive dye. Those used by the various regiments were distinguished by differently colored linings, which showed at the collar and ends of the sleeves, and generally matched the colors of the regimental and company standards. In time, they became the official facing color. On some occasions, regiments were referred to, for example, as the Blue Regiment or the White Regiment from these colors, though in formal correspondence they were referred to by the name of the colonel. Each company had its own standard, 6 feet square. The colonel's company's standard was plain. The lieutenant colonel's had a cross of St. George in the upper corner nearest the star. The major's had a flame issuing from the cross, and the captain's standards had increasing numbers of heraldic decorations, such as roundels or crosses to indicate the seniority. The new model army always had 2 musketeers for each pikeman, though depictions of battles show them present in equal numbers. On the battlefield, the musketeers lacked protection against enemy cavalry, and the 2 types of foot soldier supported each other. For most siege work, or for any action in wooded or rough country, the musketeer was generally more useful and versatile. Musketeers were often detached from the regiments, or commanded for particular tasks. Pikemen, when fully equipped, wore a pot helmet, back and breastplates over a buff coat, and often also armored tassets to protect the upper legs. They carried a 16-foot pike and a sword. The heavily burdened pikemen usually dictated the speed of the army's movement. They were frequently ordered to discard the tassets, and individual soldiers were disciplined for sawing a foot or 2 from the butts of the pikes, although senior officers were recommended to make the men accustomed to marching with heavy loads by regular route marches. In irregular fighting in Ireland, the new model temporarily gave up the pike. In battle, the pikemen were supposed to project a solid front of spearheads, to protect the musketeers from cavalry while they reloaded. They also led the infantry advance against enemy foot units. When things came to push of pike, the musketeers wore no armor, at least by the end of the Civil War, although it is not certain that none had iron helmets at the beginning. They wore a bandolier from which were suspended 12 wooden containers, each with a ball and measured charge of powder for their matchlock muskets. These containers are sometimes referred to as the 12 Apostles. According to one source, they carried 1 pound of fine powder for priming, to 2 pounds of lead and 2 pounds of ordinary powder, the actual charging powder, for 3 pounds of lead. They were normally deployed 6 ranks deep, and were supposed to keep up a constant fire by means of the countermarch, either by introduction whereby the rear rank filed to the front to fire a volley, or by retroduction where the front rank fired a volley then filed to the rear. By the time that they reached the front rank again, they should have reloaded and been prepared to fire. At close quarters, there was often no time for musketeers to reload, and they used the musket butts as clubs. They carried swords, but these were often of inferior quality, and ruined by use for cutting firewood. Bayonets were not introduced into European armies until the 1660s and so were not part of a musketeer's equipment. Artillery. The establishment of the new model army's artillery varied over time, and the artillery was administered separately from the horse and foot. At the army's formation, Thomas Hammond was appointed Lieutenant General of the Ordnance. Much of the artillery was captured from the Royalists in the aftermath of the Battle of Naseby and the storming of Bristol. The establishment of the new model also included at least 2 companies of firelocks or fusiliers, who wore tawny coats instead of red. Commanded initially by Major John Desborough, they were used to guard the guns and ammunition wagons, as it was obviously undesirable to have matchlock-armed soldiers with lighted matches near the gunpowder barrels. The artillery was used to most effect in sieges, where its role was to blast breaches in fortifications for the infantry to assault. Cromwell and the other commanders of the army were not trained in siege warfare and generally tried to take fortified towns by storm rather than go through the complex and time-consuming process of building earthworks and trenches around it so that batteries of cannon could be brought close to the walls to pound it into surrender. The army generally performed well when storming fortifications, for example at the siege of Drogheda, but paid a heavy price at Clonmel when Cromwell ordered them to attack a well-defended breach. Logistics. The new model did not use tents, instead being quartered in whatever buildings were available, until they began to serve in the less populated areas of the countries of Ireland and Scotland. In 1650, the tents were each for 6 men, a file, who carried the tents in parts. In campaigns in Scotland, the troops carried with them 7 days' rations, consisting exclusively of biscuit and cheese.